Jed was always there in a way, you know, it was quite useful. Jed would say, things don't matter so much, you can choose to see them the way you want to. At least I think that's what Jed said. I could phone Jed anytime I needed to. But there was definitely something about him you couldn't put your finger on. There were things about him which were quite peculiar. It was this kind of emotional flatness that was very distinctive. He didn't really seem sad. He mostly wasn't really there. I mean, yet he could be quite engaging. Did I ever tell you about the time we were driving around? We'd been sailing all day. We were driving home and suddenly the car started to make a whistling noise. Just out of the blue, it just started to make this whistling noise. There were times when he would just say things over and over and over again. No one really seemed to notice. They just let him get on with it. He'd just say things over and over again for no apparent reason. There was no trigger. There was nothing we could see that had triggered this kind of state. It wasn't pathological. You know, it wasn't pathological or desperate in any way. And then he would snap out of it and behave as if nothing had ever happened. In his job there were lots of forms and lots of paperwork to fill in, and he absolutely hated them. He would wrinkle his brow and push his glasses up his nose with his pen. I don't know what the forms were for. There were just so many of them. Being locked into all this bureaucratic paperwork was a frustration that took him away from his intended focus. He hated paperwork. He would look me quite intensely in the eye and focus my attention, and then say quite flatly, actually, there's no finite meaning and you shouldn't seek this. You should instead try and understand the layering of existence. What may be a question, but what is also just a sound. I was 12. So as we were driving home, the whistling sound grew louder and louder, and eventually Jed couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to stop. And he got out the car, and as he opened the bonnet of the car, the radiator cap shot off and the stream of rusty water came out, covered him from head to toe. He very casually picked up the lid of the radiator cap, which was on the floor beside him, put it back on, closed the bonnet. We got into the car and he was kind of covered in this rusty water, and he said, "It's not necessarily important. It's not necessarily important. It's not necessarily important." Sometimes he would just shrug his shoulders and kind of look from left to right. Jed wasn't the tallest man. He was about 5'7", and he had thick glasses which he'd wear on the end of his nose. He'd say, "All these places look the same, you know. They're all quite similar." But he'd say, "You know what? I've just noticed it, and it actually doesn't bother me." There were times when Jed would just shrug his shoulders and say, "You know, this is never going to change. This is never going to change. This is never going to change. You know, this is never going to change. This is never going to change. This is never going to change." And then he'd walk to the front door and he'd reach for his keys and unlock the door and go. He lived in a house that was almost entirely carpeted, and now and again he would do some renovation to his house, and he would replace the carpets each time he did the renovations. There was the inner Jed and the Jed mask, and he used to operate in these two kinds of modes, on these two kinds of levels. He would mostly deal with what he believed to be important. That's the story of Jed, and Jed was very free within this context. There was no existential crisis within Jed. The existential crisis revolved around Jed, but not within Jed. So these are things you had to contemplate, but they're internal, and Jed was very privately internal. There was no way you were going to penetrate Jed's private interior. What went on there was only Jed's business.